Come on, buddy. Come on. You can do it. There you go. Hello, people. We are going to look at our good friend over here, DistroTube. And it's fact-checking common myth about open source software. Also, this is meant to be entertaining. Maybe you learn something. Maybe, I learned something. We don't know. Don't go and harass anyone, okay? It's meant to be an entertaining. It's meant to be, again, hopefully teaching something or you learn something, but that's it. And it's opinions. But yeah, let's get into it here. I suspect this is going to be a good one because I heavily disagree on a lot of his views. And he likes bacon.
Topics related to various free and open source projects out there, because here lately on some of my videos I've noticed that a lot of people are really confused about certain things. I noticed this the other day on my Hey DT video where the thumbnail here talks about I don't cover Chrome OS because I don't cover things like Chrome OS and Vivaldi and Microsoft Edge and things like that because they're proprietary software.
Here's the thing. Why? Why not cover them? Why not showcase them and say, they are good technologies, they do the job, but here's why I don't like them. It's a little bit close-minded mindset to have, and here's the problem with that. You put yourself into a bubble where you don't see things on the outside, you don't get new input, you don't get new information, you limit yourself quite a lot. Listen to your detractors, listen to your haters, listen to people that disagree with you, use things, investigate things, you don't like, you don't agree with, so you can educate yourself better on those areas, so you can educate other people better on those areas. It's massively bad. Just want to put that out there. It's massively bad.
And when I mentioned this, I got many comments on that video telling me Chrome OS is in fact free and open source software, and so is Google Chrome, and so is Microsoft Edge, and so is the Vivaldi browser, and many other things.
So I don't know if he's going into it. They use free and open source components. Vivaldi is not free and open source. They say themselves on the web page.
Things that are in fact proprietary software. And I understand why some of this is confusing. I'm going to get to why certain people are led astray on these topics, and we're going to actually set some of the facts straight on that here in just a second. Another video where it seemed like a lot of people were really confused. My video about Odyssey as a YouTube alternative. And I had several people in the comments section of that video tell me that Odyssey is no different than YouTube because in fact Google owns both YouTube and Odyssey. And that's actually not true. I will actually demonstrate that is in fact not true.
Odyssey is not a competitor to YouTube. It's not even near a competitor to YouTube. If you want to be a competitor to YouTube, like a serious competitor to YouTube, you need to bring in the same numbers, you need to bring in the same avenue. You need people like me and people like him to make kind of the same amount of money over there. It's a different side. It's an alternative, but it's not a competitor. Yeah, I just want to put that out there.
I understand why people are confused about this as well.
Oh yeah, and YouTube don't own Odyssey.
So today, again, I just wanted to cover some of these topics, and I'm going to pull up my web browser, and we're going to do some quick Google searches, and we're going to verify that, in fact, a lot of these myths are, in fact, myths. Now, one thing I wanted to briefly touch on with free and open source software versus proprietary on my...
Free and open source is not the same. Free Software Foundation and the open source movement are not the same. My video, Linux versus Free Software Foundation, watch that. It's like 8 minutes long, and it's me taking snippets out of what Linus Torvalds' philosophy is around coding and development and what the Free Software Foundation is. And if you look at it, they are not compatible.
Hey DT, the other day I mentioned that there's no middle ground. Something is either free and open source software or it's proprietary. And that's absolutely true.
It's not absolutely true because you can use open source code in proprietary software. You can use proprietary code in open source software.
lot of people seem to be confused about that statement because they're like, hey, DT, you've got free and open source software on your computer, but you also said you have proprietary video drivers, Wi-Fi drivers, things like that. Like you have to use some proprietary software, but you said there's no middle ground. I mean, in the licensing of a piece of software, there is no middle ground. You either are free and open source or you're not. There's no in between. So if
there are so many licenses that allow you to lock down different part of the code and not other parts of the code.
Something has any proprietariness to it, any proprietary stuff added to it at all, then it is proprietary software. It cannot license itself under a free license.
So when I compile the NVIDIA proprietary kernel to Linux, it's now become a proprietary software.
Like the MIT, BSD, GPL, Apache license, the Mozilla license. You can't use those licenses if there's any proprietary stuff.
Wrong. The MIT MIT actually allows you to take the license and proprietary it and use proprietary bits and bobs within the license. The BSD license do the exact same thing, you just have to credit the author. The Creative Commons license is basically a non-license. It allows you to do whatever the fuck you want
Going on with your piece of software. So it's either 100% open source, free and open source, or it's proprietary, right? If there's 0.01% of proprietariness to a piece of software, right, then it is in fact proprietary software.
There are so many Linux kernels out there that have proprietary bobs, and there's so many other software that use proprietary bobs in it. When I say bobs, I mean code. So they are now proprietary. Or is it not black and white, and some code that's part of the code is proprietary and other is not? Because you have to remember this, when you're compiling the NVIDIA kernel, as I said, you're now morphing that into the kernel. It's becoming part of the kernel. So you can actually debate, if you want to, that we are morphing proprietary code or infecting proprietary code into Linux kernel's code. I hope this makes sense.
Again, there's no middle ground. It's either free and open source or it's proprietary. And that's not me making this up. There are definitions describing what free software is and what open source software is. And again, there's just no middle ground.
Again, free software is one thing, open source is one thing, and proprietary software is one thing. The BSD license 1 is one thing, the BSD license 2 is one thing, the BSD license 3 is one thing, the MIT license is one thing, the Apache license is one thing, blah, blah, blah. Some of them are compatible with each other, but there are so many aspects into this that him saying it like that and making it black and white, I think what he means is that either you can see the source code or you don't.
Around here, and you can verify this quickly as far as what a license of a piece of software is if you just use a Google search. Just pull up Google and do name a program.
Why is he using Google and not DuckDuckGo or any of the, like, for a free software advocate? Makes no sense to me.
License. And typically,
and privacy for that.
It will tell you what something is licensed under. For example, let me pull up my browser here, and I'm just gonna try this out. Firefox license. Oh, the very first search result, Mozilla public license.
Yeah, and if you look to the right, you can now see the Mozilla public license. The Mozilla public license is a free and open source, weak copyright license for most Mozilla Foundation software. And it says down there, GPL compatibility to yes by default, and then it gives on, other reasons. So he didn't even need to click the website. Again, he apparently don't know how to use Google.
That's right. That's is what Mozilla uses to license all of its software, like Firefox, and that is a free license. So that's very easy to verify, right? Now, what if I wanted to check the license on Windows 11? Now, I'm probably going to get information about license keys and things like that, so I don't get like something obvious answered here, but what I could do is do Windows 11 Wikipedia, if I could spell Wikipedia right, and just go to the, if it's a big piece of software, go to their Wikipedia page, and Wikipedia always gives you the licensing information.
And again, Wikipedia is not always factual. Actually, a lot of times there are students that have got into problems by citing Wikipedia because I can go in and I can modify Wikipedia. And there's a lot of instances where people modify information on a thing on Wikipedia to promote a viewpoint, a philosophy, or a political leaning, meaning they are changing what's in there from something that's factual because they don't like that fact to something that's non-factual because they like that. So take everything you read on Wikipedia with a grain of salt. It's not 100% always correct. A lot of times it is, but you need to do more than one. You need to basically validate what Wikipedia is saying.
And you can see source model, it's closed source. So right there, it's proprietary software. And I hover over what closed source means, and it tells me proprietary software, also known as non-free software or closed source software. So there's no question, right?
Next slide.
Is closed source.
This is biased running out of his fucking ass right now. Look at again. You can't see it from my ugly mock down here, but it says closed source available through shared source initiative. So you pay either a license or something like that. I don't even know what that 100% means right now. I haven't looked that up. Some component open source. Read the whole fucking thing. This is the problem I have with people like this. They find something that backs up what they say, and they don't fucking read the rest. So let's say I really wanted Distro to be a bad person. I can for sure find in one of his videos where he says something that will make him look really fucking bad, okay? And I can take that sentence and say, look, DistroTube is bad. You're not looking at it in the whole context here. I just took this one thing to confirm the bias that I have and throw it out there. This is the most fucking unintelligent way of conducting research and trying to convince your audience about something that is not even funny.
Software, of course, nobody had questions about Windows, but sometimes you try to do a search on some things and it's not so obvious. So one of the ones that's kind of confusing, Google Chrome, and then various things based off of Google Chrome, various browsers based off of Google Chrome like Vivaldi, Microsoft Edge, or the Chrome OS operating system, which is browser-based based off of Google.
Again, they are a mixture of license. They have proprietary component, they have open source component, they have free software components, they even fucking sometimes have BSD license components in there. And I'm spitting all over your guys' faces, I'm sorry. I hope you people can understand that a piece of software is not always made up around one component and one license. There are different components with different licenses. That's why, for example, converting Photoshop to open source may not be possible. They have licensed technologies out from other companies they are using in their software that can't be open source. Because if they open source their code, that company has to open source their code, and they may have been using code from other companies that now they have to open source their code. You kind of see the rabbit hole we go down here. I think his biases is like creeping up into his fucking anus and coming into his brain and tickling his analytical skills a little bit here.
Google Chrome, and a lot of people are like, all of that stuff's open source because Google Chrome is open source. No,
not all
type
of it,
in
no.
Google Chrome license, it is freeware. Now, freeware is not to be confused with free software, right? Freeware is in fact a type of proprietary software. It's called freeware because it's free as in free of cost, but it...
You can also debate that the Linux is freeware. It's just freeware with an open source license. Freeware basically just means that you don't have to pay for the software. It even says it up here. You can't really read it here, but it says that freeware is software's most often proprietary. Not always, but most often proprietary. Again, biases tingling the brain.
Doesn't necessarily meet the definitions of free software or open source software. They don't make the source code available typically for freeware.
And he says here, typically. That means that some do. He's contradicting himself.
They don't allow you to modify it and redistribute and get all the freedoms associated with free and open source software. Freeware just means it's proprietary software, but you don't have to pay for it, essentially. And one of the really confusing ones is Vivaldi. If I type Vivaldi browser license in Google, Typically you'll get an answer when you ask Google, name a program license. It'll spit out GPL or MIT, or sometimes it'll actually say proprietary software. And in this case, it spits out BSD license. So naturally, a lot of people are legitimately confused here that Vivaldi is in fact licensed under a free license, the BSD license. So it is in fact free and open source software.
It is, because the BSD is compatible with the free and open source movement, but it also allows you to proprietary your software. And I'm getting light in my face, I'm sorry for that.
But if you go to this webpage on Vivaldi's website, you have to dig a little deeper. Vivaldi actually tries to trick people into thinking it's free and open source software.
Are not.
It's very shady. It's a really scummy tactic, and I think more people need to call out the team behind Vivaldi on this, because they are legitimately trying to scam people. They're trying to trick people, and they're just dishonest. Because when they say Vivaldi is licensed under the BSD license, Vivaldi, the engine of Vivaldi, is the Chromium web engine, which is in fact open source software.
Again, what did I just say, you fucking idiot? I'm getting fucking angry right now. Software, a lot of time, is built up around different components, specifically operating systems, software suites, web browsers. You have, you have the engine that displays basically your fucking website. Then you have, let's say, GPU optimized code in there. Be another license. Then you have the UI design, another license. You kind of get what I'm saying here. A lot of the I don't know if a lot, but let's read what you guys can't see it here, but I will read it for you. Vivaldi is not made available under unified open source license, so that means that they are using code that open source licenses are not compatible with. It does contains the Chromium source code with changes made to the HTML, CSS, JavaScript-based UI to run. All changes to the Chromium source code are made available under a BSD license and can be used by anyone on NVIDIA or Vivaldi source. So this means that they are taking the engine, so think a little bit like the kernel. They're taking the kernel from the web browser that's based on the open source Chromium. They are modifying those modifications they are giving you as a BSD license. The BSD license allows you to proprietary lock it down to whatever you want. You just have to basically, depending on what license it is, but the most used one, you just have to credit the author. Okay? So there are stuff in there that's open source. There's stuff in there that's BSD license. There's probably also stuff in there that is proprietary. One piece of software a lot of times contains a lot of different licenses. Details in this regard are explained in the README and license files within the package. In addition to our UI code is written in plain accessible code for those who read HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This means that for all practical purposes, the Vivaldi source code is available for audit. They don't say that you can take it. They don't say you can use it for your own purposes, but you can audit it, so you can look at the source code and you can send it back to them. That's one of the things that the BSD license allow you to do. Vivaldi also contains third-party code. License for these parts can be found in the source package and in the installed browser by navigating to Vivaldi credits. So third-party code can again be proprietary code. Just like he's using Linux, the kernel, that's open source, and then he's adding in proprietary codecs and shit like that on top of it. Is Linux now proprietary software? He makes no fucking sense whatsoever.
Chromium is licensed under the BSD license. The Chromium web engine is licensed under the BSD license. But the complete browser on top of that engine, the UI and everything that Vivaldi adds to that, Vivaldi adds its own proprietary license to that. And again, either something is open source.
No, it's not a proprietary license. They say you can audit it. You can look at the source code. It's a how can I say? It's a semi-open source license. But the BSD license is regarded as an open source license because what Vivaldi is doing is that you can look at the source code, you can't use it. So it's just a definition about what is open source. Is it open source if you can look at the source code, or is it only open source if you also can use it, fork it, and modify it? He just contradicted himself right now, again, as he do all the fucking time. That open source means you can look at the source code, and proprietary you can't. Well, Vivaldi gives you the option to look at the source code. You just can't copy it, you can't fork it, but you can audit it and submit fixes back to them. If you actually go and read about Vivaldi, they are even addressing making Vivaldi open source, and they have said that they are thinking about it, but it makes no financial sense right now, and the benefit from the work they have to put in to make everything open source, they don't see it as being that big. Again, research what you're talking about instead of just Googling and taking the first fucking link you find. He has no idea about how Vivaldi works. And it shows. Again, he's finding something that's confirming his bias and disregarding any other fucking facts out there.
Or it's proprietary. There's no middle ground. And what Vivaldi does even further to confuse people is this statement here. It says, in addition, our UI code is written in plain, accessible code for those who read HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This means that for all practical purposes, the Vivaldi source code is available for audit.
How is that confusing? How is that confusing? You can audit the code. What does auditing mean is I can read it and I can tell you, oh, something is wrong here. Just like if you're auditing a book. The author gives you a book to audit. You're reading the book and you're giving him feedback on the book. That's what it means. How is this confusing? It's plain. I'm not even a native English speaker and I know what the fuck this means. Oh.
Now, that's tricky right there, right? Because
no, it's
they
not.
did not say Vivaldi is open source. They said Vivaldi, the source code, everything is out there for you to look at. You can go look at the source code. That means
No. They didn't say anything. They said the UI code. That's not everything. The UI code. Get your fucking facts straight.
The source code is available. That's what the free and open source community typically calls source available. Now, source available is not open source. For something to be open source, it also has to allow you to modify the code, redistribute the code, right?
That's his definition of open source, and I think it's the GPL definition of open source, of free software, not open source, because open source allow you to do those things. He's now mixing in free software with open source, if I'm not mistaken. Open source is not the same as the Free Software Foundation or the Free Software Movement. They are two different things. They have a lot of overlaps, but they are not the same.
Going to be licensed under one of the big free licenses that guarantees you certain freedoms. Vivaldi doesn't do any of that. Vivaldi is in fact a proprietary license. It has terms of conditions and an end user license agreement.
A lot of open source software have an end user license agreement or EULA. You know why? It basically tells them that here's the thing I hate with people like this. They don't actually read the end user license for open source software. If you read it, it says a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times that if you fuck your computer up, if it blows up in your face, we are not reliable. They're just using a lot of fucking lawyer talk to say so, but that's mostly what most end user licenses is. If you look at Bash code and you scroll down and you see that this software is provided with no guarantee and blah blah blah, that is an end user license. That's an end user license. Most open source software do that. They go in and they say, if you use this software, you use it at your own risk and it's delivered as is. And if things goes tits up, we are not reliable, financially or physically or any way, shape or form. That is basically an end user license. You don't have to agree to it or well, you kind of have to agree with it because you can't use the software if you want them to pay for something that goes tits up. It's just covering their ass legally, basically.
None of it is BSD or GPL or any other free license you've ever seen.
The BSD license allow you to do that. Know your fucking license. The BSD license allow you to take the code that I make, put out as BSD, and you can proprietary it. It allows for those circumstances. It also allows for use of proprietary code within the BSD license code. And again, I am really paraphrasing here and simplifying a lot of things, but I hope.
But they're tricky here because they're like, well, we're kind of open source because we're our web engine.
No, components of the software is open source. Other components is a variable source. Other components is audit a variable source code. For a guy that thinks he knows how software is made and built and understand the tech world, he really don't understand much about it.
It's based off of Chromium, which is open source, and our UI, we make the source code available. But you can be proprietary software and make the source code available.
Exactly.
That is not what open source means. Open source.
But it's under the BSD license, so there are things what the BSD license mean.
Source does not mean just make the source code available. It's a much deeper definition than that.
That's his definition. He subscribed to a philosophy, and that's the one he airing out right now. Getting biased out of the fucking asshole right now.
If you actually go to the Open Source Initiative website, let me pull up my browser again. On the Open Source Initiative's website, they actually have the official definition of what open source means.
Then don't call Vivaldi open source. They have never claimed that they are open source. They said that they were BSD licensed with open components to the source code. So he takes open and source and mixes them together.
What that term means. What something has to meet to be qualified as open source. There are 10 criteria.
And that's not, a lot of those are not compatible with Free Software Foundation, or some of them are not.
Piece of software must meet for it to be legitimately and
here's one of them. License must not restrict other software. The TPL is like, hey, we want you to restrict other software, meaning that they have to follow their license. The license must not be restricted on other software that is distributed along with the license. For example, the license must not insist that all other program distributed on the same medium must be open source software, and that's the one that Richard Stallman don't really like that much.
And legally called open source.
No, this is not a legal document. This is not a legal document. I hate when people use bullet points as a legal document. This is not a legal document. This is their definition of open source. It says the open source definition by the Open Source Initiative. This is how they look at open source. If you then ask with Stallman, he would say something different in some of these instances here. And you will also call that open source. This is not a legal document. This has never been used in court to identify what open source is, and until it has been proven in court to be a legal document, it's not. And there's other, things that needs to be done depending on the country you live in to make it a legal document, It needs to be recognized as a legal document by authorities and blah, 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 blah.
Only one of those 10 criteria is making the source code available. So,
what about free distribution?
Again, what Vivaldi is stating on their website, and they're smart. They don't actually come out and say that Vivaldi is open source.
Because they are not open source. They are BSD licensed, and some will not see that as open source. This is him bending semantics to fit his narrative. If you read, any intelligent person that read this will not say that Vivaldi is open source. What they will say is exactly what they say here, that they are using source code for some projects that is open source or BSD licensed, and they use other software code that's under different licenses. And that their modifications is open for you to audit. It's fucking middle school English, man.
Of course, they ask this question, and then when they answer it, they don't actually answer it. They never state, yes, Vivaldi is open source. If Vivaldi was open source, this would be one sentence. Is Vivaldi open source? It would be, yes, Vivaldi is open source. But they give this roundabout answer without ever really answering it, and it's confusing to...
No, they are actually really good at explaining what they are doing. They are really, like, if you find this confusing, my English is really bad. You can hear that from speaking, okay? I'm a dyslexic as fuck, okay? I have reading problems, both in my native language and in any language whatsoever. This is so fucking simple that it's not even funny. Could they have said, is Vivaldi open source? They could have said, no, not really. Or yes, we use open source components. But because they want, or they know that people will be like, explain to us, please, why you say you have open components and not, and that's what they are doing. Because had they just said no, they're like, but you're based on the Chromium source code. Is that not open source? And then they have to explain them anyway. So they are foreseeing people like him being like, oh, you just said you're not open source, but are you not using the Chrome engine? So they explained, so people like him, or people with a better English understanding than him, actually can see what they mean, or what their licenses are, that they are using, like any other fucking software out there. They are using components with different kind of licenses that make up the whole of the software.
The people that don't know better. I understand why it's confusing, but in fact, Vivaldi is proprietary software. The people that wrote this garbage here on their website should be ashamed of themselves. And you people that actually use Vivaldi and like it, I'm sure it's a fine product. You need to actually call the Vivaldi team out on this kind of shenanigans and actually make them...
Okay, there was an edit there, and I am sure that in that edit he called... I use Vivaldi, so I am sure he called us stupid, idiots. I don't know if he did that. But I suspect he will call us any fucking name in the book because he don't like proprietary software. And again, Vivaldi, or Vivaldi, or whatever the fuck he will call it, the license is explained right here. Why have we spent the majority of the video complaining about Vivaldi when they have explained exactly what they are on the fucking webpage?
Either change the wording on their website and actually admit that they're proprietary software, or...
They kinda did. It's like, they explained, so people that can read English and understand basic English can see that some of the components is this, other components is that, and our UI changes is something else. How is this confusing?
Actually open source their software properly and license it as it should be under one of the big free licenses. And I'm not gonna...
That's the problem. He just wants them to do what he wants them, what he thinks they should be doing. That's his problem. He wants them to go GPL. What if that's not doable because they're using blobs of code that can't allow that to be done, that they have licensed out from other people?
Go into Microsoft Edge. Microsoft Edge is licensed under a proprietary license. Just Google it. It'll come up. It's
show us.
Proprietary software. It's based off the open source Chromium engine, but Microsoft doesn't try to lie and claim it's open source, right? Microsoft admits, yes, Edge is licensed under a proprietary license. One of the more confusing ones is Microsoft's VS Code, because VS Code technically is open source. If you do a Google search, VS Code license, you'll get a link to their GitHub where the license for VS Code is actually the MIT license, one of the free licenses. So it's definitely free and open source.
That also allow you to do whatever you want with the code. So I can take code from the MIT, that's MIT license, copy it into my code and proprietary it. I don't have to give back, I don't have to credit anyone.
For software. Here's the tricky part with Microsoft and VS Code though. Most people that install VS Code get an official binary from Microsoft themselves. Microsoft packages the binary, especially on Windows, but they also make binaries for Mac and Linux. And those official binaries that Microsoft packages, which 99.9% of the people that run VS Code actually use the official binaries, right? And those binaries are actually relicensed under a proprietary license. The source code is out there. You know, it is free.
Wow. Wow. What they have licensed. Oh my god. Okay. We all know what an exe file is. The package format that Windows use. Let's just use that instead of deb and RPMs, because I think that's why he's confused here, my friend. That technology is proprietary. And you can take open source software. I think even the fucking GIMP is packaged under a exe file, okay? And there's different ways of doing that, but they are using their own proprietary way of doing it. So the binary, the exe install file may be proprietary. The installer, the packaging format and stuff like that. But the VS Code themselves, the code to the Virtual Studio Code is open source. That's why we have an open source version of it that has some elements of some plugins that's proprietary taking out of them that you can install, and so on and so on. So he's saying that because the wrapper around an open source software is proprietary, we are now making, or that would now mean that I can't fucking think right now. That would mean that the Virtual Studio Code is proprietary software. Again, if you're associating one component of a software with another one, Linux is proprietary software because we are using proprietary code and morphing it into the kernel or plugging it into the kernel and other system or other areas of the system. So that does that automatically mean that everything is now regarded as open as closed source? No sense whatsoever.
In open source software, VS Code, you can go find all the code for VS Code on GitHub, and you're free to do whatever the hell you want to do with it. You can compile VS Code yourself if you have the skills, but that's not what most people do. Most people go and get the binary from Microsoft, and Microsoft then changes it from free and open source software to proprietary software, which they're allowed to do because...
No, it's the packaging format.
The MIT license actually allows you to take something and then relicense it under a proprietary license if you want to. This is something that the GPL license doesn't allow, which is one of the reasons I'm a big fan of the GPL. But unfortunately, the MIT license, the BSD license, the Apache license, they're much more
He really likes sucking that GPL cock.
Permissive and allow companies to play these kinds of games. We should also clear up some of the meaning behind the terms free software and open source.
Thank you.
Because a lot of people seemed really confused by this, because I see people that make weird claims like Richard Stallman obviously founded what is known as the free software movement. He's the one.
Here's the thing, movement. Really be careful when people are using that in any sentence whatsoever. When it's a movement, you need to be careful. Because then we're going into really, how the fuck can I say it? Like shady waters.
That basically created the phrase free software.
No, they don't. Free software has had many meanings way before Richard Stallman and long after him, and still to this day have different meanings. They are just using the word free software in their terms. You know, they are using free software to mean one thing, and there are other people using free software to mean something else. It's not wrong as long as society are agreeing upon it, they have different meanings. Another good example, if you're going into English, let's see if I can remember a word that have two meanings. Cat. It can be the name of a person, or it could be a destination of an animal. Which one is right and which one is wrong? Cat can also be short for Katharina or Catherine. It all depends on what situation and in what sentences you're using it in. Do a Danish guy with basic English knowledge have to fucking explain English to this dude?
When I say that, people immediately reject that as like, free software, that's just two really common terms that probably been in use decades before Richard Stallman ever uttered these words. So Richard Stallman clearly didn't invent free software. Well, yeah.
No, he invented his version of the free software meaning.
He did. Free software in its current definition, and by current definition, I mean as defined by the Free Software Foundation.
Yeah, that's their definition. This is not a legal document. This is not an Oxford Dictionary legal document. Just like I said, cat can have different meanings. I think what you call this is social constructs, where society are agreeing upon that this is a ruler. They are agreeing on that this is what you call a Swiss Army knife. We are all agreeing upon that it can be that. We can also agree upon that words can have different meaning, depending in what sentences we put them in, what situations they are being used at, and a lot of other aspects of it. He just cornered or used his own definition of free software. This is what he means by free software in the situation regarding source code and development. If you are making a software that's proprietary and you're giving it away and you're calling it, this is a free software, meaning you don't have to pay for it, that's okay. You are allowed that because free software have many meanings. It's not a binary, like words and speech is not binary. Kent, my name, has different meanings. It can be shortened for a name like Kenneth. It can be a part of the southern part of England, or it can be designated as a surname, or it can be my first name. Which one is right? Depending on who you ask. If you're living in Kent, you will, in that situation, say that, well, Kent regards to either a person or where I live. If I was called Kenneth and everyone just called me Kent, it now has a different meaning. That don't mean that any of those are right or any of those are wrong, but we have to acknowledge that just because one group of people say that this is what we mean by this term, don't make it universally that. It's just like when we are talking about free software within the GPL construct, within the GPL system or ecosystem, or the GPL philosophy, or the Free Software Foundation philosophy. This is what they mean by free software in that situation. This don't mean that free software means this for everything else. This is a really unintelligent take on this. I'm so sorry to say that.
For a piece of free software to be considered free software, it has to meet 4 criteria. It has to meet these 4 essential freedoms here. And that is what Richard Stallman means when he uses free software. And that's what everybody in the free and open source community means.
Yes, the community, but that don't mean that if someone else is using it in another community is wrong. Because they have constructed the meaning around that term in that community. Granted, it makes up for a lot of confusion.
When they talk about free software, yes, did people before Richard Stallman talk about free software? Yes, they talked about...
Why is this free software? This guy, there was no life before Richard Stallman. Then Richard Stallman came out and ate his own fucking foot skin, and the world was a better place. He is the original author of software philosophies, development methods, and wording. He is now influencing how we speak in Danish, how we speak in fucking Uganda, how we speak in Australia. No, he made a society. He made a group, a movement, and then they took words that are used in the English language and in the Danish language and other languages, and they put their own meaning into those words.
About software that was free of charge. That free software is not the free software we're talking about today. So yes, Richard Stallman.
It is. If that's what they mean by free software, fucking hell, dude. If Microsoft wants to call Virtual Studio Code free software because they give it away for free, that's one definition of free software. Then there is another definition of free software within the Free Software Foundation. This is what makes language so difficult for a lot of people, is that there are a lot of things that changes meaning depending on where they are used. How can a stupid Danish fucking guy understand this and apparently an intelligent tech guy not? I'm really, really fucking confused right now.
Is in fact the founder of the free software movement. Another one.
He is the founder of the movement, but he can't pawn or take ownership of words.
That I sometimes, people come back at me because I mentioned this on a video the other day. It might have been that Hey DT episode about Chrome OS, and I talked about what is open source, and I said open source kind of really got its start with Linus Torvalds and Eric Raymond, especially coming up with that term as it's known today as what open source software.
No, they just made a definition of what they think open source is. Just like Richard Stallman made a definition or explanation about what he means by free software. It don't mean that they were the originator or this is what you have to buy into. This is just what this basically means. It's like when you're reading a document and they're like, okay, when we are saying organization, and then there's asterisks and you go down, we are referring to IBM, Microsoft, and blah, 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 blah. That is what they're doing here. So they're giving people an explanation. So when you're having a conversation with Just Stallman, he's giving you an asterisk that say, when I'm saying free software, this is actually what I mean. And Linus Torvalds and Eric Raymond, I think his name is, when you're talking to them and they're saying open source, they're giving you an asterisk and say like, okay, this is what we mean by open source. That's all they're doing.
Is today. And some people like to come back at me about that because open source, that term has been around for decades before Eric Raymond.
And for people that do that, I applaud you because you're right.
And Linus Torvalds and all of that. And that is true, but like the free software definition, when people talk about open source now, they're talking about open source as defined by the Open Source Initiative.
No, only if you're talking to people in that organization. Again, words can have different meanings. That's why we have the asterisk. That's why we have the definition. I don't know how this is not blatantly obvious.
We're talking about software that meets these 10 criteria. Yes, people use the term open source way before Linus Torvalds and Eric Raymond. But they were talking about open source as the source is open, available. You can view the source code. They're talking about source available back.
No. That's what he had put into it. Now he's putting his asterisk into what he means. He's now saying, when you're talking to me, DistroTube, Derek, this is what I mean by free software, this is what I mean by open source, this is what I mean by source availableness.
When they were talking about open source now means something completely different.
No,
it means
depends on the person you're talking.
You have to meet these 10 criteria. If you don't meet one of these 10 criteria, you are in fact not open source.
What are you then? Just source available, mixture? What? This guy, fucking stupid.
So again, it's a different way. I know it's confusing, but free software actually means something.
No, it's not. It's really not confusing.
You have to meet those 4 essential.
He is making it confusing. Like, listen to him. I'm confused.
Freedoms. Open source actually means something. It means you have to meet those 10 criteria.
Within the definition of the open source movement's definition, again, I'm making this harder than this. That's the open source movement definition of open source.
Yeah. Now, free software doesn't mean it's free of charge. That has nothing to do with free software.
Again, depending on who you're talking to, the situation. Here's the thing. Nothing is legally a thing until it's been proven in a court of law. Nobody has gone to court because someone has used the open source term in a different way than what he's describing right now.
Open source doesn't mean the source code needs to be available. That's one very, very small part of what open source actually means. Now let me briefly talk about another point of confusion with people about Odyssey, because I made that video the other day about Odyssey, and people were like, you know what, this has gone way too long. Is Odyssey owned by Google and stuff like that? We kind of get the idea here. I simply just can't. I fucking can't. I'm so sorry. I do my best to be open-minded. I do my best to not judge people. I do my best to accept people's opinions and view. And I am all for him thinking the way he thinks. I just don't like him to try and make me think that way. And that's what he's doing. He's saying that if I use a word in another definition, I am wrong, even if you can fucking look it up in the Oxford Dictionary and it has different meanings. Because he thinks it's right, the way he uses it. He can't seem to grasp that software is built up around different modules with different licenses. I hope to God that he's not that stupid. I really do. I hope that he's just playing us all. What he has said up till now, I spent over an hour fucking reacting to this video. What he said up till now, most of it makes no fucking sense. I don't know this guy. He's probably a fucking nice guy, and he's probably fun, and he's great to talk to. But this video here, he seemed like this one-track minded person that want you to buy into what he believes. He's to some extent a priest in a cult or something like that. I need a break. See you all later. Bye bye.